Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Happy Friday, I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Well, this week we had our live recorded episode on Gene Stratton Porter from our live show in Indianapolis.
Yes, what a fun time.
It was a very fun time. We had very good luck overall in terms of our travel.
Yes, this show was recorded in that magical, awful time where the software glitch caused a lot of problems for a lot of airlines.
Yeah, anytime we are planning to travel somewhere for some kind of live show, there's sort of a mental calculation about like how long the flight is, what the flight schedule is like, and if we flew to the venue on the day and there was any kind of problem, is there any chance we could still make the show? We've had a number of times where flying on the day has been fine, especially when we've been like on a tour going from one city to the next city to the next city. Usually we're flying that morning, doing a show that evening, next day, do it all over again. People who've been listening to the podcast for a really long time may remember the time that we had a live show to do in Dallas and our flight got diverted to Shreveport. That is the closest to a show not happening that has ever happened to us personally so far, knock on wood. This time, just the combination of the length of flying, especially from Boston, like there are not a ton of direct flight options into Indianapolis from the places that we live. So we flew in the night before.
Yeah.
And then the next morning got up. And I think the first thing I saw on my phone was you texting me saying, I'm glad we flew in last night. And I was like, what is happening right now? And then I learned that there was a huge IT problem that had led to cancellations all over the place. We might have still made it if we had flown in on that day, but it would have been really, really close. And if it had not worked out, the ticketing system at the Historical Society was also affected by the bug.
Yes. So for them and they couldn't email people because that was also affected.
Right.
So
everything.
If it had gone, if it had not happened, if we had not made it there, there may have been a lot of people showing up to discover that we weren't there. So I'm glad we got. I'm glad very lucky.
It worked out as it did. And then the flight home, mine was early and yours was a little late but manageable.
Yeah, mine was delayed by like 4 hours in the end.
Uh-huh.
That didn't bother me a bit. I was sitting there eating and having drinks and I just hung out and I kind of had it in my head that might happen, so I was not chagrined in the least. It was just fine.
Yeah. So that was our travel experience, traveling on a particularly fraught travel day. Gene Stratton Porter, we made it clear in that episode that I had a lot of fondness for, and then got to the part of writing a novel that was definitely a product of its time. Not clear whether it reflected her own personal attitudes or not, but regardless of whether it did reflect her own personal attitudes, like it was a novel with a very racist person as the hero. And that sort of tempered
your adoration.
My adoration, because I really was, the whole time I was working on it, reading her descriptions of the birds and the moths and the things that she would do to try to get good pictures of them. Like, I loved it so much. We did not bring up in that episode that a lot of what she wrote about and a lot of what she thought about nature and life had a lot in common with the Transcendentalists. And the Transcendentalist movement was significantly before her time, really. A lot of those folks were writing long before she was. But they were for sure people whose work that she knew and referenced and was familiar with. Like there are quotes about Thoreau and her various writing, stuff like that. And so I kind of went back and forth about whether to talk about how she clearly was influenced by the Transcendentalist movement. And there was so much other stuff already in the episode that I did not wind up putting it in there.
Yeah, it was a lengthy episode to begin with, so you got to make cuts.
Yeah. especially when you are doing a live show that is scheduled for a certain amount of time. And you want to still have a few minutes for questions at the end, which we did have some questions at the end.
Yeah.
Some of the folks who were there were people who work at the historical societies or historical sites that are associated specifically with Jane Stratton Porter, places that she lived, Limberlost Swamp, all of that. I think they have maybe a little bit more insight into her thought process regarding her husband.
Yeah.
And the impression that I got is sort of in line with what I had concluded without like getting into a ton of detail, which is that like she definitely had made it clear from the get-go that she was not going to be like the traditional wife.
Right.
And that if what he wanted was for someone to stay home and keep house and raise children, that was not what she was doing. So I think he definitely on that front knew what he was getting into when he married her. I still am real foggy though on like the specifics of when she moved to California and he didn't.
Right.
Like what I can imagine a million different scenarios there, in a range of just like he had businesses that he had to attend to and couldn't really move at that point, to her being kind of like, I would rather go be on my own. Don't really know.
Yeah.
So she did tend to be very private about a lot of her more personal thoughts and feelings on stuff.
Which makes sense given, we talked about in the episode that she had to move in some cases to get away from people showing up on her doorstep. So like I could completely understand a lockdown situation on any of your personal business.
Yeah.
Even if it's completely benign.
Yeah. And we really see the same thing happening today with people who become famous in one way or another and suddenly have Reddit communities or whatever devoted to dissecting everything they say to look for hidden clues about their personal lives and feelings and stuff. That is really invasive. And I feel like that's something that like the growth of the internet and the growth of social media really enabled at a scope that was not quite so possible when people's outlets were things like conversations and letters with their friends and newspapers and magazines and stuff, and not like an online, always-on community where people can spend extraordinary amounts of scrutiny on an offhanded comment someone gave in an interview or whatever.
I mean, I obviously that comes with some inherent weirdness and danger, but I do often just chuckle at people in, completely harmless ways, trying to like pick apart things people have said and figure out like what they're actually trying to telegraph. And often it's like, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
You're literally like, that person said that thing about doors closing and then went on with their day. It didn't mean anything especially weighty, but now you've attached this meaning to it that they have no part of. Those always fascinate me a little bit.
Yeah. I used to be an avid reader of a blog called Ask a Manager, especially when I was a manager, which I'm not anymore. And I learned so much from that blog about being a manager. And it's often described as like a really supportive comment community.
Yeah.
But I've also very frequently seen, especially if somebody writing a letter was doing something that seemed maybe troubling or unpopular, like just inordinately close reading, looking for subtext of things that people have said. And it's like, this is an email someone wrote to a blog. They probably didn't spend 3 weeks fine-tuning the wording on it. And if they did spend 3 weeks fine-tuning the wording on it, it might not actually mean anything. So,
well, those are the moments where I always find myself being like, wait, does this mean all of these people are always speaking in like a cloaked, clouded version of what they're actually thinking? And I'm like, oh, who has the energy for that? Like, I don't, this is why I'm a very direct person.
Right.
I can't even be passive aggressive. It's too much work.
So yeah. Anyway, Gene Stratton Porter. We wanted to do an episode that was related to something that was happening at the History Center while we were there, and I'm glad that was the one that we chose. I'm glad we got to make a quick run through the exhibit about her while we were there. That's again running until October.
It's a beautiful exhibit.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Before we made this trip, I had kind of thought about like, would it be reasonable to try to go out to one of the historical sites associated with her? And I did not start looking into that with any kind of planning at all, but it also became clear that like what needed to happen was resting before the show,
Yeah.
not going on a road trip somewhere to see her house or Limberlost Swamp or something.
Such fun. Such fun. That is the cool thing. If you are in that area and are thinking about going, go, because there are a lot of her photographs and photographs of her as part of that are really, really fun to look at.
Yeah, they are really good.
And they also have a fabulous Chuck Taylor exhibit going on right now, which I was very excited about.
Took a
and
very quick pass through that also.
Their staff very kindly, as they were trying to close down for the day, let us run through there. I just wanted to see shoes.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about this week was 3 diseases named after places.
Little uplifting, fun, light discussion that won't leave you feeling weird or paranoid at all.
I know. When I was sort of writing the intro to it, originally I had this like very explicit sentence that was like, if getting sick from an incredibly casual exposure just out trying to live your life is gonna make you have intrusive thoughts for the foreseeable future, maybe skip this. And then I was like, that seems a little heavy-handed for a content note. But yeah, when I heard about the outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in at the Mountain State Fair in North Carolina, that was just like people walking past a hot tub display, I was like, yikes. I feel that way about pretty much every norovirus outbreak that is traced to a specific place. Holly, you and I have talked about how I went on the Jonathan Colton cruise in March of 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic was about to start. It hadn't been declared a pandemic when we left.
Teetering on the brink, yeah.
Yeah. And you and I have talked about your surprise that I got on the ship.
I was literally telling people, Tracy's not getting on that boat. I guarantee it. She's gonna decide the night before that's not happening.
One of the big reasons that I did is that at that point I had been on several cruises, and norovirus outbreaks are so common on cruise ships that every single time I went on one of these, I was like, is this the time that we're all getting norovirus on this cruise? And when we left, COVID was still being downplayed. I don't remember if they had even named it COVID yet, but like it was still being downplayed in a way that was very like, just wash your hands.
Right.
Don't go licking stuff. You'll be fine. And so it sort of felt like something a little riskier than maybe the flu, but having already had the idea of infectious illness factored into going on a cruise so many times, it just sort of felt like this is another potential disease thing.
This is a normal way to think about a cruise anyway.
Yeah. And then, then while we were on the cruise, suddenly the COVID situation, it didn't actually become a lot worse. It had been that bad the whole time.
Right. It just got recognized finally.
It got recognized.
Its importance.
It's being a lot worse. I used to have a job that involved reading the CDC's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report.
Yeah.
So, I have a weird nostalgia for it. I have also worked at a job one time that got written up in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report.
Yeah, claim to fame.
And as I was scrolling through to get all of the reports about the Legionnaire's outbreak and the Norwalk illness outbreak, just scrolling through, I found one that was about a cruise ship outbreak This is just a sentence quote. Quote, coliform bacteria in numbers too numerous to count were found in the ship's potable water distribution system. And I was just like, yikes.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yikes, yikes. This was one of many yikes moments of working on this episode. Another big one was the research involving the people who were incarcerated at the prison. Because the first thing that I read about, it was almost like a side comment that was one of those things that was printed in a medical journal, seemed to just take for granted that the people reading would know what this study was. So it was sort of like a not even full sentence of, and then the experiment, blah, blah, at the prison. And I was like, oh no, I need to look at more information about this experiment at a prison. And I have access to lots of different journals through multiple library cards and memberships. And this was one where I needed to ask my spouse to get it from where he works because I didn't have access to any of my local things. And I sent him this email that said something like, can I have this paper, please? Do not read it. Do not even look at the headline too closely. And he sent it back to me and was like, I'm glad I got this after lunch and not before. And I was like, I tried to warn you. And then when I opened it, I had accidentally asked for like a commentary that was from later on that had the identical title of the original paper. And I had to ask him
to get it again.
To get another one. I felt really bad about that. Yeah. And then I was like, okay, so I don't actually have more clarity on like the specifics of how they recruited people out of prison for this. I did not know that there had been other people who were not in the prison that had been part of it. Anyway, you talked about having thoughts about how diseases are named.
I do, because, and this actually ties into a bigger discussion, in my opinion. So I found myself like thinking in that moment as we were discussing the way that we have to be very careful to not name a disease after any place or group or anything. It's a kind of a depressing take, so just know that.
Okay.
We cannot, I'm going to not use expletives, but pretend they're all in here because there are exasperated expletives in here.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot trust our fellow humans to not be jerks.
Well, sure.
And I hate that. And it makes me sad.
The people that started calling COVID before it even had an official name, but people who started applying terms about Asia.
Yeah.
And in some cases, just using explicitly racist language about Asia and Asians to describe, like, it sucks and it's awful.
It does. And I feel like we're in the reason why I say this opens up like a bigger thing is that I feel like if you look at the psychology of the way people interact with information about illness, like I understand 100% your little lizard brain has a fear response. Mm-hmm. And so you want to push away any of that in any way you possibly can. But like, I feel like we are in this unique position right now where we have just watched people and continue to watch people deal with information about contagious disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope someone is doing a lot of research on the psychology of how we have all managed. I mean, I know there have been some, but I really feel like there could be a big holistic examination of the ways that, in some ways I feel like being at the point where COVID is now considered endemic and not an acute just pandemic going on, that a lot of people who got through it relatively unscathed kind of feel like superhuman and like they maybe are not taking the possibility of other infectious diseases
right.
as seriously as they could or should. It's just really weird. And then, of course, people that recognize that they are either predisposed because of other existing conditions, or perhaps they got a particularly bad case of COVID and may have recovered, but now are concerned about, we have seen cases of like long COVID that pop up several years after the fact, or, things that we don't even have really a whole lot of documentation for. I feel like it's separated people into thinking like, meh, it's fine, and others into like, Everything is potentially a serious disease.
Yeah.
Like, we all need to be really careful. And those two mindsets are having a lot of struggle with one another.
Yeah.
And I hate that. I wish everybody could be cool.
I think a lot of people from a lot of different directions have various frustrations about how the CDC handled and messaged around the COVID pandemic. Which I think, like, even though there is essentially nothing being done at this point, I think is still, because of its worldwide prominence, like, still technically classified as a pandemic.
Right. The World Health Organization, I don't think, has changed
They've
it.
never,
No.
yeah. And there's some stuff where it's just like, it gets so frustrating. Like, I am at this moment getting ready to take a trip to take my elderly parent to get a medical procedure in the state of North Carolina, where there is a new law where, like, there's kind of a medical reasons exception about it, but, like, a law about mask wearing in public.
Ugh.
And I'm just like, I'm taking my dad to a medical facility during a big COVID wave. Like, there's a lot of COVID going around right now. My mother is incredibly high risk. And I would just generally not like to get COVID, because when I got it, which I've only had it once, it was bad. I didn't have to go to the hospital, but I missed multiple days of work. And then for a week after that, I had to work in a recliner. And when I tried to record, my watch kept telling me my heart rate was too fast. And, like, then I was just exhausted for probably another 2 weeks after all that. And it's like, that is not just a cold, which is what people like to say.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I was just thinking about this the other day. My husband and I were just discussing it because I had traveled a few weeks back, and two of the people that I had traveled with or had seen during my travels tested positive for COVID not long after.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a little bit before I saw you in Indiana, and I knew you had this coming up. So I was, like, testing every day.
Yeah.
And I never had symptoms, and I never tested positive. And I even did, like, a grown-up test in a facility, negative. And I was like, I don't know if I just got lucky, because I'm very, like, tactile. I hug all my friends, I kiss them on the cheek, etc. And I was like, I don't know why I didn't get this. And I was asking that, we were talking about vaccination status, and I was like, did you get your spike vax? And at least one of those people was like, what? And I was like, we have failed in messaging about this too. Like, I feel like now, when I have talked to numerous friends, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, because a lot of people who are pretty darn informed are like, I didn't even know we had another one coming. I didn't.
Right.
There has, unless you're, like, going to your GP on the regular and your GP is really on top of it.
Right.
You might not know that there are new variations that will that are being formulated theoretically to keep up with the shifting mutations of the virus. But, like, if you aren't doing that, it's not like there are bulletins going out. It's not like you would have to literally be hunting it down on your own all the time.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I think information is sort of going out within medical professionals and, like, not making its way to the public, unless you wind up on the COVID cautious side of TikTok. In which case you might get more information than is really helpful to you. That sort of brings me around to, like, the last thing that I had written on my, like, list of ideas to talk about on the Friday behind the scenes, which is that at the beginning of COVID, there were a lot of steps that were being taken. A lot of times people thought they would be helpful steps, would not really be helpful steps, that included things like either wiping down or disinfecting restaurant menus, or giving people a way to order things that was not a physical menu that they would hold. That's not really helping for COVID. There's a lot of stuff that's still around that's like recommendations to protect yourself. And one of those things is hand washing. And, like, people get really snippy about it and are like, that's not how COVID spreads. COVID is airborne. And I'm like, you know what does spread that way, though? Norovirus.
So much stuff.
Yeah, you know what else I would not like to get? Norovirus. There's just so much. There are lots of foodborne illnesses that like hand washing is a big part of protecting yourself and protecting other people if you are preparing or handling their food. So I get a little irritated by like this sort of weird almost backlash against hand washing because it is not a preventative for COVID.
Like, here's my thing. It takes so little effort and
Right.
it can protect you from other stuff. Why would you fight this?
Right.
Why?
Yeah.
I do have a personal hilarity of my own ignorance on a thing, which I don't know if someone told me this growing up and I just operated with this for a long time, or if I had made a presumption based on something someone told me when I was a kid. Because for the longest time, I thought, to get away from less scary things, the differentiator between having a cold and having a flu was if you barfed.
Huh.
Like, I didn't know that you could have a flu that was not about, like, throwing up or having bathroom emergencies. I just thought that was a super bad cold. And this is a falsehood that persisted in my knowledge base well into my adulthood.
One of my personal pet peeves is the term stomach flu, because that has nothing to do with influenza.
Right.
Influenza is a separate thing.
Right.
That's its own illness and can also be very serious. And like a flu shot every year is not going to protect you from whatever GI illness that people are describing as stomach flu.
Right.
I thought you were going to say you thought the differentiator was whether you have a fever.
No, I literally thought it was a barf situation.
Yeah. Yeah. The one time as an adult person that I have actually been diagnosed with the flu, I was also very sick. And I did not have to go to the hospital, but I think I missed an entire week of work. And I remember calling our coworker at the time, Julie, to tell her that I was not coming in for like the fourth day in the row.
Yeah.
And when I got back to the office, she was like, "You sounded so bad. I wanted to disinfect my phone." So anyway, that's just my little personal pet peeve about the term stomach flu.
Yeah, I believe it. The discussion of PPE made me chuckle a little, which is not to say that it's a laughable thing. I'm trying to figure out the best way to discuss this without being disgusting. Some number of years back, as you may recall, I had a little surprise hospital stay. I've had a couple of those. I sound like a sickly person. And I'm quite robust, really. But I had what turned out to be a bacterial intestinal infection. That was a little scary at the time, but I'm fine. But initially, when they admitted me, they did not know if I had C. diff, and those tests take a while to come back. So my poor nurses, who were amazing, had to hazmat up every time they came in my room. And you would have thought I had cured a long-term unwieldy disease when they found out that they no longer had to do that anymore. It just is such an arduous additional step for people that are managing the care of multiple people at a time. And it slows down their whole like schedule for the day. I certainly appreciate that they do it and that all of that was being done, but obviously I was also very grateful. But when you were talking about like the need to do training on how to use it, I was like, oh yes, because
even just gloves, like even if the only thing you're doing is putting gloves on, it is very easy to, especially taking gloves off, do it in a way that you touch your skin with a glove. And now that's contaminated.
Right.
And I also I think I did want to say, I don't think I actually said this in the episode anywhere, but like the World Health Organization investigators who came during the first Ebola outbreaks, they really stressed, like they were like, these medical staff are people who care about what they're doing. They're doing their best, they just don't have the resources and the training to be able to prevent an outbreak of an illness like this.
Yeah.
Because like 1976, not as many bloodborne illnesses identified as now. Not as much of a focus on bloodborne pathogens prevention for their transmission. And then again, like getting into and out of a full gown and mask and gloves and booties and like getting into and out of all that, especially getting out of it after you treated somebody without, like it's a whole thing. Like if you just put it on and yank it off, like you're probably going to wind up either touching your skin to it or touching something else that then is
contaminated.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also worth pointing out, right? In some of these hospitals that we were talking about, there was one you specifically mentioned the staff numbers. It was only like 17 people. So like when you consider that is a tiny group of people who in an outbreak situation are then having to care for a lot of people. Like it's so easy in the desire to, even if you're being very careful, just to like speed up that X amount that somehow breaks that whole chain of caution that you have to maintain in the putting on and taking off. Like, I can't imagine. I don't think I would probably do it properly in that scenario.
Right.
So it's easy to be like, oh, they didn't know any better. What a bunch of, like, no.
No. Well, and I think that 17-person staff was at a facility that had 120 beds. So like, it's like a lot of patients for each nurse. That also somehow reminded me of like, I've heard people who work in medicine talk about how a lot of times family members don't realize how easy something is to spread. So like a well-meaning family member will refill the water pitcher for their sick loved one, not realizing that water pitcher has now contaminated the water fountain with whatever that person had. Like, it's an ongoing thing. Anyway, I feel like we have taken a number of digressions from...
I will also say, germane to the listener mail, I do have an episode coming about Norway.
Nice.
It's not great. It's not an upbeater.
Well,
so just brace for that. But yeah. But I would love to do more Norwegian topics because it sounds great.
Yeah. Whatever's happening on your weekend, I hope it goes well. I hope if anybody in your circle is ill, including you, I hope everybody is recovering as well as possible. Everybody washes their hands. You can find our show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back with Saturday Classic tomorrow and something brand new on Monday. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.